right into the chat after. There's a specific Q&A, so we're just going to do the last presentation, and then we'll do Q&A, so everyone else can ask the questions.
Am I okay to start?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak, and I'm conscious of time as well, so I will be grateful for the reminder when the time comes. So hello to everybody from Ireland, and it gives me great pleasure to, I'm very grateful for this opportunity, so I want to thank Susan for this opportunity, and I hope that the next few slides will be interesting, informative, and hopefully promote some new links and connections. I guess when I started out in this field, I started out in 2007. And at that time, when I was interested in male victims of abuse, violence, domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, whatever the name that you want to call it, there was very few people who wanted to hear me speak. And I was at the back of one little niche of a conference. So I remember it's really encouraging to have a full conference dedicated to this really important problem. So it's great that there is a community, and I have to thank Susan and everybody actually for coming together. So it's a real honor. Just in relation to, I've picked aspects of my research, but just to give you a background of my research, and it's really interesting that there's a lot of resonance with what has gone before me as well as what I've done, what I'm going to show you now. So I guess I'm informed by my doctoral study of men's life stories of abuse, of intimate partner violence. I identified a phenomenon known as second wave abuse, and I think that's really relevant, particularly given what people were speaking about earlier on. I've evaluated men's at helplines, a little bit like some of Denise Hines's work. I have, looked at a qualitative and quantitative analysis of that, and also I've supervised men's written and verbal abuse narratives, and also I'm almost at the point of finishing supervising a student doing her PhD in the area of gay and bisexual men's stories of abuse. So I'd really like to link up with Brenda and also that other gentleman that said he wanted to link up. So that would be really interesting to hear and network with you later on. Also, my personal findings on years of reflection in this area and aspects of being denied that this phenomenon didn't happen, it didn't exist, and ridicule from this area as a woman working in this area in particular. And, I do notice a lack of theorization in the area, and I think that's something we could work towards. But there's also tends to be a lack of coherence and unity. And in fact, there can be, pitches, male victim support networks against female victim support, or like this disconnect between the two. And in fact, they're just both sides of the same coin, and the phenomenon is violence and abuse. So I've written again, a lot of people tend to research single gender. So I've researched women. My first, as a nurse, I'm a nurse by background, I teach nursing, but I've looked at how women present to the emergency department, which was very interesting, and I learned a lot that way. But also I did witness men presenting, and they presented very differently. So you can see, kind of just wanted to make it evident that there's a broad amount of aspect where I'm coming from, and I use the pink ribbon as a symbol of breast cancer awareness in Europe anyway. And I guess I use that useful analogy because domestic violence, intimate partner violence is often thought of, as the previous speakers have said, as a female phenomenon. However, if you equate that to breast cancer, that's something that mostly women get, but men get it too. And do we deny men those services? Do we, should we say they don't exist? No, we don't do that, but we provide them with different kind of care because their presentation is different. And that's the way I like to view domestic violence as it experienced by men. So this was the title of my presentation, How Do Men Talk About IPV? And I guess the quick answer is with great difficulty. And there's reasons for that, and I'll explain in my next slide. So these are mostly informed by my doctoral work, but also other studies. So the constructs, as have already been said, there's a lot of resonance with the first two speakers. The constructs of masculinity and also intimate partner victimization, they render abuse of men as invisible or impossible, because it's not possible for to be a man and to be a victim, because they're like almost oxymorons. They can't actually coexist together. So that makes it very difficult for men to actually see themselves as victims, you know. And actually, that's quite interesting while I'm talking about that. Men, in all of the narrative research that I've used and studied, the word victim is never mentioned. Men don't see themselves as victims. So it's, even though we use that language as talking about men, they never really say it about themselves. So it's men experiencing problems, and abusive behaviors would be better. So what I also have found is that how IPV is traditionally defined as insufficient. And I feel that there's first wave abuse and also second wave abuse that we don't really think about. And the main way in which men talk, and it was very interesting that one of the participants in the audience, I heard a man talk about his own experience, and it's the same thing. So men are most comfortable. They first talk about how they are as fathers. And that's the most dominant narrative strategy men use to talk about violence and abuse that they're experiencing, because it's a socially acceptable dominant identity, and they use that identity to convey their harrowing experiences of abuse. Also, the second way is via a husband or a partner. For those men who don't have children, they do use what's called a husband, partner, provider narrative. Now, there are abuse narratives. Men do talk as victims, but however, how they speak is quite different. And I'm going to give you some examples in a few minutes. Biographical work, I found, seems to be central to recovery. And what I mean by that is the more men talk and the more men account for things, whether they diary log, whether they say things, because it is so invisible. But if they use ways like talk, like diary, to make it visible, it makes it easier for them to acknowledge the phenomenon that's going on and also to recover from it. And in all my years, IPV still remains largely invisible in the field, and that's for many, many reasons. It's from a personal, and as Brenda just said earlier on, people don't recognize it themselves. Even the LGBTQ community don't recognize it. Men don't recognize it. It's hard to recognize. But also, when they do seek help, service providers don't acknowledge things like frequency of abuse, and the nature and diversity of abuse that's being experienced. So when somebody says, so when they're collecting data, so this is from my research on helplines, for example, they would only categorize abuse in a singular, as in physical abuse once, whereas it could be physical abuse 10 times a day. Frequency is often not factored in. So these affect what we understand and what we know about domestic violence. Okay. So this relates to my doctoral work, and so how the nature of abuse, I found two different types of abuse, and I'll explain that in a minute. And I've just talked about how men talk and the language in which they talk, using an abuse narrative, mostly the fatherhood narrative, that's the biggest one, but the good husband narrative as well. And I'll give you some examples of that. So just to talk about the nature of violence abuse. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the more first wave abuse is what I call kind of classic conceptualization of abuse. But what I did find with men, they experienced a phenomenon known as second wave abuse. So that was abuse not just initiated and enacted by the abuser, but it's initiated but not enacted. So the female partner is setting up situations by which the man can be further abused. So it's a different way of thinking of abuse, but the men in the research that I've undertaken clearly experience that as an abusive experience. So I think it's something that this field needs to think more about. So the way they talk, I've told you this, the fatherhood narrative seems to be the most prominent narrative, and lost fatherhood in particular is the worst kind of abuse. Good husband narrative is that men articulate themselves as good providers, and then the abuse narrative is fragmented and contrasting. So I'm just going to show you some examples of these. So this is an example of fatherhood narrative, very dominant. So men will articulate how good they are and how committed they are to their role as fathers. And then also they articulate loss and loss of parenting. And that is extremely acutely felt as hurt and pain by the men as they articulate. That particular quote that you'll see is from an analysis of a helpline. The one at the top is from an interview. So the data comes differently, but the same thing, same trend seems to be coming up. Also, the good husband, this is just a small example. I'm conscious of time, so I don't want to labor too long on any aspect. So the good husband, good provider narrative. So that's when men are want to explain that they really have fulfilled the criteria in their role as good providers or partners or husbands of their wives or partners, and then also it has been the very means by which they've been hurt. So that's what I mean. So they're very comfortable, they're very easily articulatable, and the men seems to be quite they're quite strong in the text. Whereas on the other hand, you'll see the difference between, sorry, park that about the abuse narrative. This is just an example again about second wave abuse via the fatherhood narrative. So this is an example of a man not being believed, and a wife made a false sexual allegation claim against him, and that meant that he was the primary carer, but because he actually lost access to his children because of this false allegation, and the services completely didn't believe him and undermined him. And then also there's an example of when he went to court, and these here he uses, for example, it's quite extreme, has the judge said, has she ever hit them with the frying pan, has she cut them with a knife? And then she's their mother, I'll save you coming back. And I guess that's representative of that complete invisibility to the realities that men experience on the ground. Again, this is more of second wave abuse, service providers not believing. So this first man was hit by a woman. She threw boiling water on him. And again, the last sentence I think I want you to pay attention to, this is the plan. She's not hitting me because she wants to hit me. She's hitting me because she wants me to hit her back. And if he hits her back, then that's actually subscribing to that dominant norm. That fits the dominant narrative out there. And then that would actually be game, set and match, as he says, about his partner, and she would actually be in complete control, and it would be extremely difficult if he did. So they're different. They're just more examples of men not feeling believed. So this is the abuse narrative that I was talking about, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll draw your attention to the red text. So notice that they're quite, the language is different. There's a fear language, there's kind of vulnerability language in this narrative. So it's quite different in how it's articulated compared to the fatherhood narrative and the good husband narrative, good provider narrative. So you'll see things like, she'd make me clean it, and then the child has to stand up for daddy, she'd this red mist, she was scary. So it's a different kind of language that men use, and it's very, they do speak about it, but it doesn't flow as well, and it isn't as much in their narrative as the other kind of narrative. So I guess that really sums up how men seem to talk. And I'm going to finish up very shortly by saying, it's great to really be here and listen to all of the really interesting stories internationally. And I guess whether we're, psychologists, researchers, police, healthcare providers, we're all trying to do the same thing, and that's to improve the life of men and families. And I like to use this, the bottom right there, you'll see this, it's a mosaic, and Howard Becker talks about the scientific mosaic. And I think all of our research, all of our points, everything that's going on in this conference will be a little piece. My little piece is one piece in that big mosaic, and hopefully all of our pieces together will help give us a bigger understanding of this phenomenon. Hopefully we can improve men's lives going forward. So I'm just going to leave you with a quote from a very famous individual, Nelson Mandela, and I think it's the importance of education. And you can see here, it's through education that the daughter of a peasant can become a doctor, that the son of a mine worker can become head of the mine, that the child of farm workers can become the president of a great nation. And most important also, and that men and families can be even better served by greater understanding. It is what we make out of what we have, not what we are given, that separates one person from another. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Corbally. I think now we'll do a 10-minute question and Q&A. Does anyone want
to? Hi, my name is Michael. Dr. Corbally, thank you for that presentation. I don't see you. Are you still there?
I am, yes. My
Great,
video
awesome.
is on, but I don't know whether you can see me.
Yeah, no, I can't, but that's okay. I wondered if you could expand on something you said at the beginning of your presentation or early on, the concept of how men and women present differently in the emergency room. I'd be interested to understand more about what those the differences in the presentations.
Okay, so in the emergency room, the main difference is quite often women would present with quite more severe injuries, more severe, that was my own personal timer, more severe physical injuries. So they would, you know, they could have spinal injuries or more, you know, physical injuries. Whereas the injuries that the men would present with in the emergency department would be more subtle. So there would be finger, you know, they would be less. So the men might use different excuses for why they got they might have scratch marks down their face. There could be ligation on the neck, but they're more subtle in terms of, whereas a woman, for example, could come in on a spinal board after being physically beaten up, whereas men's injuries tend to be more minor in terms of clinical severity, but they're very hard to you know, find. Now, actually, one of the man that actually prompted me to do my research in the first place had a very curved mark around his face, and he was hit by the edge of a frying pan on his face. And when he presented, he told the nurses, and they laughed. I was a junior nurse at the time, so that really didn't rest with me at the time. And that, to be honest, I don't know who that man is, but he is the man who inspired me to do my research.
Thank you.
No problem.